The moment I saw Karen Grayson's silhouette marching up my driveway at 7 in the morning, I knew my peaceful Saturday was about to go sideways. I was sipping my coffee on the front porch of my house in Riverside, California, enjoying the cool December air and admiring the light display I'd spent 3 weekends installing. The warm white string lights traced the roofline, wrapped around the porch columns, and illuminated the pathway to my door. Nothing flashy, nothing garish, just elegant lighting that made my home look welcoming after dark. I'd even installed matching lights on the community gazebo down by the neighborhood park, completely at my own expense, because I thought it would be nice for everyone to enjoy. Karen's heels clicked sharply against the concrete as she approached, her blonde bob bouncing with each aggressive step. She wore a pristine white pantsuit despite the early hour, and her face was already twisted into that expression of righteous indignation I'd come to recognize from our previous HOA meetings. "Lucas Thompson," she called out, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "We need to talk about your lights." I set my coffee mug down on the porch railing and stood up, keeping my expression neutral. "Good morning, Karen. What about them?" She stopped at the bottom of my porch steps, crossing her arms over her chest. "They're excessive. They're gaudy. And most importantly, they violate our HOA covenants regarding exterior decorations." I'd expected this conversation eventually, which was why I'd done my homework before installing a single bulb. "Actually, they don't. I reviewed the covenants thoroughly before putting them up. Section 12. Subsection 4 allows permanent exterior lighting as long as it's not colored or flashing." Her face flushed pink. "That's for security lighting, not decorative displays." "The code doesn't specify security lighting," I replied calmly. "It says exterior lighting." "These are warm white LEDs. They're stationary, and they're professionally installed with proper electrical permitting from the city. I have all my paperwork if you'd like to see it." Karen's jaw clenched. "I'm the HOA president, Lucas. I think I know what our covenants mean better than you do." "I'm sure you're very familiar with them," I said, keeping my tone respectful despite her condescension. "But the language is pretty clear. I even had my attorney review it before installation." That stopped her for a moment. Her eyes narrowed. "Your attorney?" "My attorney," I confirmed. "David Chen over at Morrison and Associates. He specializes in HOA law. He assured me that my lights are fully compliant with all current covenants and California state regulations." The color in Karen's face deepened from pink to red. "This is a residential neighborhood, not a shopping mall. Your house looks like a commercial property with all those lights. It's bringing down property values." I had to bite back a laugh at that one. "Karen, I'm an architect. I designed these lights specifically to enhance curb appeal while staying within code. If anything, tasteful permanent lighting increases property values. There are multiple studies showing that." "I don't care about your studies," she snapped. "I care about maintaining the character of this neighborhood, and I'm telling you as HOA president that those lights need to come down." I picked up my coffee again, taking a slow sip before responding. "And I'm telling you, as a homeowner who pays his dues and follows the rules, that they're staying up, unless you can show me specific covenant language that they violate." Karen's hands balled into fists at her sides. "Fine. I'll call an emergency HOA board meeting. We'll see what the other members have to say about this." "You do that," I said. "And while you're at it, you might want to review the procedures for covenant amendments. I believe any changes require a 2/3 vote of all homeowners, not just the board." She turned on her heel and stalked back down my driveway, her heels clicking like gunshots. I watched her go, already knowing this wasn't over. Karen Grayson didn't like being told no, and she especially didn't like being corrected in front of witnesses. My neighbor Jim was washing his car across the street, clearly having heard every word of our exchange. Jim gave me a thumbs up and called out, "She's been on a tear lately. Third complaint this month." I waved back and sat down to finish my coffee, but the peaceful morning was definitely ruined. I'd moved to the Riverside Estates development 2 years ago, drawn by the reasonable HOA fees and the relatively hands-off management. The neighborhood was nice, full of young families and working professionals who mostly kept to themselves. Then, 6 months ago, Karen had run for HOA president after the previous president moved out of state. She'd won by default, being the only person who'd bothered to run, and immediately started treating the position like she was the mayor of a small dictatorship. My phone buzzed with a text from my friend Marcus, who lived 3 streets over. "Heard Karen paid you a visit. What did you do to piss off the HOA queen?" I typed back. "Had the audacity to install lights she doesn't like. Good luck, man." She made the Hendersons repaint their house last month because the trim was supposedly the wrong shade of white. That was true. I'd heard about that incident. The Hendersons had used an off-white trim that was literally 1 shade different from the approved color, and Karen had threatened them with daily fines until they repainted. The kicker was that the original covenant didn't even specify exact paint colors, just that homes should be maintained in good condition with neutral tones. Karen had pushed through an amendment adding a specific approved color palette shortly after taking office. I spent the rest of Saturday preparing for the inevitable confrontation. I pulled out all my documentation, every permit, every receipt, every page of the covenant review that David Chen had provided. I even printed out the relevant California state laws regarding HOA authority and homeowner rights. If Karen wanted a fight, I was going to be ready. The emergency meeting notice arrived in my mailbox on Monday, hand-delivered by Karen herself. I watched through my front window as she made her way down the street, stuffing identical envelopes into everyone's mailboxes. The meeting was scheduled for Wednesday evening at 7, to be held in the community center. Tuesday afternoon, I got a call from David Chen. "Lucas, I heard from a colleague that your HOA is trying to make an issue of your lights. Everything's still by the book." "Exactly as we planned," I confirmed. "The president just doesn't like them," David chuckled. "These HOA boards love to overstep. Do you want me to attend the meeting?" I thought about it. Having legal representation might seem aggressive, but it would also send a clear message that I wasn't backing down. Let me see how it goes, but be on standby in case things escalate. "Will do, and Lucas, don't let them bully you into anything. You're legally in the right here." Wednesday evening arrived with unseasonable warmth. I dressed in business casual, slacks and a button-down shirt, wanting to look professional but not overdressed. I gathered my folder of documents and walked the 3 blocks to the community center, arriving 15 minutes early. The community center was a modest building with a large meeting room, a small kitchen, and bathrooms. I'd been there for a few social events and previous HOA meetings. Usually, these quarterly meetings drew maybe 15 to 20 homeowners out of the development's 200 homes. Tonight, the parking lot was packed. Apparently, Karen had drummed up quite the audience. I walked in to find at least 60 people already seated in the folding chairs that faced a long table at the front of the room. Karen sat at the center of the table, flanked by the other board members. Frank Morrison, the treasurer, a retired accountant in his 70s. Patricia Hayes, the secretary, a middle school teacher in her 40s, and Dennis Kraft, the board member at large who owned a local plumbing business. Karen's eyes locked onto me the moment I entered. She leaned over to whisper something to Patricia, who glanced my way with a sympathetic expression. I took a seat near the middle of the room, nodding to a few neighbors I recognized. Marcus slid into the seat next to me. "This is wild," he whispered. "I've never seen this many people at an HOA meeting." "Karen's been campaigning," I murmured back. At precisely 7 o'clock, Karen banged a gavel against the table. Where she'd gotten a gavel, I had no idea, but it was such a quintessentially Karen move that I had to suppress a smile. "This emergency meeting of the Riverside Estates Homeowners Association is now called to order," she announced, her voice carrying through the room with practiced authority. "We have one primary item on the agenda tonight: discussion of exterior decorative lighting that violates our community standards." She didn't even pretend this wasn't about me specifically. "As many of you may have noticed," Karen continued, standing up and gesturing like she was giving a presentation, "one of our residents has installed excessive lighting displays on their property. While we appreciate enthusiasm for home improvement, these lights create an inappropriate commercial atmosphere that is inconsistent with our neighborhood's residential character." She clicked a remote, and a projector screen behind her lit up with photos of my house. She'd clearly driven by at night specifically to photograph it, and I had to admit, my house did look striking. The warm lights created a welcoming glow that highlighted the architecture beautifully. "As you can see," Karen said, pointing at the screen with a laser pointer, "this is excessive. This is not a shopping center. This is not a hotel. This is a family neighborhood." A few people murmured in agreement, but I noticed that more people were leaning toward each other with puzzled expressions, clearly not seeing the problem. Karen advanced to the next slide, which showed a close-up of my porch. "Furthermore, these lights create light pollution that affects neighboring properties and potentially violates our dark sky provisions." That was interesting, considering our development had no dark sky provisions and Riverside itself had streetlights every 50 feet. "I'd like to call on Lucas Thompson to explain why he believes these lights are appropriate," Karen said, her tone making it clear she expected me to apologize and promise to remove them. I stood up, taking my folder with me. "Thank you, Karen. I'd be happy to explain." I walked to the front of the room, acutely aware of 60 pairs of eyes following me. Public speaking didn't bother me. Years of presenting architectural designs to clients had cured me of any stage fright, but the hostility radiating from Karen was palpable. "I installed these lights after thoroughly reviewing our HOA covenants and obtaining all necessary city permits," I began, keeping my voice clear and confident. "Specifically, I reviewed Section 12, Subsection 4 of our covenants, which permits exterior lighting that is not colored or flashing. My lights are warm white LEDs, they're stationary, and they're professionally installed to code." I pulled out a copy of the covenant and held it up. "I have copies of the relevant sections here if anyone would like to review them. I also have the electrical permit issued by the City of Riverside, the inspection certificate showing the installation passed all safety requirements, and a legal review from an HOA attorney confirming compliance." Karen's face was already turning red again. "Those provisions are intended for security lighting, as I've already explained to you. The covenant doesn't specify security lighting," I repeated, keeping my tone even. "It says exterior lighting." The language is quite broad, which is actually beneficial for all homeowners because it allows flexibility in how we improve and maintain our properties. Frank, the treasurer, raised his hand slightly. "May I see that covenant section?" I walked over and handed him my copy. He pulled out reading glasses and studied it carefully while Karen glared daggers at both of us. "Lucas is correct," Frank said after a moment, his voice apologetic but firm. "The language doesn't specify security lighting. It just says exterior lighting with those specifications. The spirit of the rule is clearly about security, Karen insisted. But the letter of the law is what matters in covenant enforcement, I pointed out. Otherwise, we're opening the door to subjective interpretation of every rule, which creates an inconsistent and potentially discriminatory enforcement environment. Patricia, the secretary, nodded slowly. He has a point, Karen. We have to enforce covenants as written, not as we wish they were written. I could see Karen losing control of the room and scrambling to regain it. What about the light pollution issue, the impact on neighbors? I spoke with both of my immediate neighbors before installation, I said. The Patels on my left and the Johnsons on my right. Both gave me their verbal approval. I can get that in writing if needed. As for light pollution, my lights are directed downward and toward my own property. They don't shine into anyone's windows or yards. A woman in the third row raised her hand. I recognized her as Susan Park from 2 streets over. I actually think Lucas's lights look really nice. I drive past his house on my way home from work, and they make the neighborhood look upscale. A few other people nodded agreement. They're tasteful, added another voice from the back. Not like those inflatable Christmas decorations the Millers used to have. Karen's control of the narrative was slipping fast. This isn't about whether they look nice. This is about maintaining our property values and our community standards. Actually, I interjected, studies show that tasteful permanent lighting increases property values. I have research from the National Association of Realtors and the American Lighting Association that demonstrates this. Homes with quality landscape and architectural lighting sell for an average of 3 to 5% more than comparable homes without. I pulled out the printed studies and handed them to Frank, who passed them down the table. Dennis, the board member at large, spoke up for the first time. I'm a business owner, and I have to say, if this was my house, I'd be thrilled with that kind of lighting. It looks professional and well done. Karen's hands were shaking slightly as she gripped the edge of the table. We need to maintain standards. If we allow this, what's next? Everyone installing whatever they want. Everyone can already install exterior lighting within the covenant parameters, I said calmly. That's what the covenants allow. I'm not doing anything special or receiving any special treatment. I'm simply following the rules as written. Marcus stood up from his seat. I move that we dismiss this complaint on the basis that Lucas's lights comply with existing covenants. Second, called out Jim from across the room. Karen looked panicked. This isn't a voting matter. The board decides enforcement issues. But the board has to base enforcement decisions on actual covenant violations, Patricia said quietly. If there's no violation, there's nothing to enforce. Frank nodded in agreement. I don't see a violation here, Karen. The lights comply with the written covenant language. I disagree, Karen said sharply. And as president, I'm directing Lucas to remove the lights or face fines. On what basis? I asked directly. You need to cite a specific covenant violation to impose fines. That's California law. The room had gone very quiet. Everyone could sense this turning into a direct confrontation between Karen and me, between arbitrary authority and actual rules. Fine, Karen said, her voice icy. If the current covenants don't adequately address this issue, then we need to amend them. I'm proposing a covenant amendment to explicitly prohibit decorative exterior lighting beyond simple security fixtures. That requires a 2/3 vote of all homeowners, I reminded her. Not just people in this room. 2/3 of all 200 households in the development. I'm aware of the requirements, she snapped. And, I continued, California law requires that covenant amendments be reasonable, not retroactive and not targeting specific homeowners. An amendment that's clearly designed to force one person to remove already compliant improvements could be challenged in court as discriminatory. Karen's face was now fully crimson. "Are you threatening legal action?" "I'm informing you of the legal framework we all operate within," I said. "I invested significant time and money into improvements that comply with our covenants. I have a right to protect that investment." The meeting devolved from there. Karen tried to rally support for her proposed amendment, but the room was divided. Some people seemed to support her simply out of principle, or because they'd been swayed by her initial presentation. Others openly disagreed, saying the lights were fine and Karen was overreaching. Still others seemed uncomfortable with the whole conflict and just wanted it to end. After nearly 2 hours of circular argument, Frank finally called for a motion to adjourn. The motion passed, and people began filing out of the community center. Several neighbors stopped to talk to me on the way out. "Don't let her bully you," said an older gentleman I didn't know well. "She tried to fine me for having my trash cans visible from the street, even though they were in my garage with the door open." "Your lights are beautiful," Susan Park told me. "I hope you keep them up." Marcus clapped me on the shoulder. "That was intense, man. You held your own, though." I thanked everyone and gathered my documents, feeling drained but satisfied. I'd made my case clearly, and it was obvious that Karen didn't have the support she thought she'd have. As I was leaving, Patricia caught up with me in the parking lot. "Lucas, can I talk to you for a minute?" "Of course." She glanced back at the community center, where Karen was still inside talking to a small group of supporters. "Off the record, I think you're absolutely right. Your lights are lovely and they clearly comply with the covenants. But I need to warn you, Karen doesn't let things go. She's going to push for that amendment, and she's going to make your life difficult while she does it." "I appreciate the warning," I said. "But I'm not taking down lights that I installed legally and spent thousands of dollars on just because she doesn't like them." Patricia nodded. "I understand. Just be prepared, and maybe keep your attorney's number handy." I drove home thinking about her warning. I dealt with difficult clients and contractors in my architecture work, people who refused to accept professional advice or industry standards. But this was different. This was my home, my personal space, and Karen was trying to exert control over it based on nothing but her own preferences. The next few weeks were relatively quiet. The holidays came and went, and I enjoyed my lights throughout December and into January. I got compliments from neighbors, from delivery drivers, even from the mail carrier. A few people asked for the contact information of my electrician because they wanted similar installations. Then, in mid-January, I got a certified letter from the HOA. It was a formal notice of violation, claiming that my lights violated the covenant's provisions against excessive or inappropriate exterior decorations, and demanding their removal within 30 days or I'd face fines of $100 per day. I read the letter 3 times, anger building with each reading. The covenant section she cited was about holiday decorations and explicitly stated that it applied to temporary displays. My lights were permanent installations. This was such an obvious misapplication of the covenants that it bordered on fraudulent. I called David Chen immediately. "They're really reaching now," David said after I read him the letter. "That section clearly applies to temporary decorations. Using it to target permanent lighting installations is absurd." "What are my options?" I asked. "You write back formally disputing the violation and requesting a hearing. At the hearing, you present your case. If they still rule against you, you can sue for injunctive relief. Based on what you've told me, you'd have a very strong case." "I don't want to sue my HOA," I said, frustrated. I just want to keep the lights I legally installed. I understand, but sometimes that's what it takes with overreaching boards. Send your dispute letter first. Be professional, cite the covenants clearly, and reiterate that you've broken no rules. That creates a paper trail if this does end up in court. I spent that evening drafting a response letter. I kept it factual and professional, citing specific covenant language, referencing my permits and legal review, and firmly rejecting the violation notice as baseless. I sent it certified mail the next day. The hearing was scheduled for early February, another meeting at the community center. This time, it wasn't open to all homeowners, just me and the board. I brought David Chen with me. Karen's expression when she saw my attorney was priceless. Her face went from confident to apprehensive in seconds. "Mr. Thompson," she said coldly, "this is just an informal hearing. There's no need for attorneys. Mr. Thompson has every right to representation at an enforcement hearing," David said smoothly, setting his briefcase on the table. "Shall we begin?" The hearing followed a predictable pattern. Karen presented her case, which consisted mainly of her personal opinion that the lights were excessive, and her misapplication of the temporary decoration clause. I presented my case, which consisted of the actual covenant language, my permits, my attorney's legal review, and evidence that the lights didn't harm anyone or anything. Frank and Patricia both looked uncomfortable throughout. Dennis seemed skeptical of Karen's position from the start. "Here's what I don't understand," Dennis said at one point. "If Lucas's lights violated the covenants, why didn't you cite the correct section in your violation letter? The section you used clearly applies to temporary holiday decorations." Karen stammered for a moment. "The principle is the same. Excessive decoration. But his lights aren't decorations in the traditional sense," Dennis countered. "They're architectural lighting, like landscape lights or security lights." "Exactly," I said. "They're permanent fixtures that enhance the property, not temporary decorations." David stepped in then, his voice professional but firm. "The HOA has the burden of proving a covenant violation. Mr. Thompson has demonstrated clear compliance with Section 12, subsection 4 regarding exterior lighting. The violation notice cites an inapplicable section about temporary decorations. Unless the board can cite a specific, applicable covenant provision that these lights violate, this violation notice should be dismissed." Frank cleared his throat. "I move to dismiss the violation notice on the basis that no applicable covenant violation has been established." "Second," Patricia said immediately. Karen looked furious. "We haven't even deliberated." "There's nothing to deliberate," Frank said, sounding tired. "The young man is right. His lights comply with the covenants. I'm not going to vote to fine someone for following the rules just because you personally don't like their aesthetic choices." "I second Frank's motion," Dennis added. "This is dismissed." Karen stood up abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Fine. But this isn't over. I'm still pursuing a covenant amendment." "That's your right," David said calmly. "But as I've informed you, any amendment would not be retroactive under California law. Mr. Thompson's existing installation would be grandfathered in." The look Karen gave me was pure venom. Without another word, she grabbed her papers and stormed out of the room. Patricia sighed. "I'm sorry about all this, Lucas. For what it's worth, I think your lights are beautiful." "Thank you," I said, "and thank you for voting fairly." Frank shook my hand. "Just keep following the rules, son. That's all any of us can ask." David and I left the community center feeling victorious. "That went as well as it could have," he said. "She might still push for the amendment, but without board support, it's unlikely to go anywhere." "I appreciate your help," I told him. "Anytime. And Lucas." Document everything going forward. Save every email, every letter, every interaction. People like her don't give up easily, and if she retaliates in other ways, you'll want evidence. His advice proved prophetic. Over the next 2 weeks, I received 3 separate notices from the HOA about minor issues. My trash cans were supposedly visible from the street for more than 12 hours before pickup. A small patch of weeds in my front garden allegedly violated the landscaping standards, and my car was supposedly parked on the street overnight in violation of the parking rules. All 3 citations were petty and questionable. I took dated photos showing my trash cans in my garage, my garden meticulously maintained, and my car in my driveway. I responded to each notice with evidence proving compliance and CC'd David Chen on every response. "She's harassing you," David said during a phone call. "This is retaliation, and it's illegal under California HOA law. If she continues, we can file for an injunction against harassment." I was considering that option when something unexpected happened. I got a call from Patricia Hayes, the HOA secretary. "Lucas, I'm calling you personally, not in my role as secretary," she said, her voice hushed. "Karen has been submitting false violation reports on several homeowners, not just you. She's targeting anyone who disagreed with her at that meeting about your lights. Frank is livid. We're calling for a special board meeting to discuss her conduct." "Is there anything I can do?" I asked. "Just keep documenting everything, like I'm sure your attorney told you. And be ready to provide your evidence if we need it." The special board meeting happened the following week. I wasn't invited, but Marcus was there because Karen had also cited him for a bogus violation about his mailbox placement. He texted me updates throughout. "Frank just called Karen out for harassment. Patricia is presenting documentation of false violations. Dennis is saying Karen is creating legal liability for the HOA. They're voting on whether to ask for her resignation." That last text made my heart race. Could they actually remove her? 20 minutes later, Marcus called me. "Dude, she's out." "What?" "She refused to resign, so they voted to remove her as president. 3-1 with Karen being the only dissenting vote. Frank is interim president now." I sat down heavily on my couch, relief washing over me. "How did she take it?" "About as well as you'd expect. Lots of yelling about betrayal and how she was only trying to protect the neighborhood. Then she stormed out. Again. She's really got to work on her exit strategy." I laughed despite myself. "Thanks for letting me know." "No problem." Frank said he's going to send a letter to everyone apologizing for the harassment and confirming that your lights are fully approved. True to his word, Frank sent that letter out within 2 days. It was professional and concise, acknowledging that there had been misunderstandings regarding covenant enforcement, and confirming that my exterior lighting installation had been reviewed and found to be fully compliant with all HOA covenants. He also mentioned that the board would be reviewing enforcement procedures to ensure fair and consistent application of the rules going forward. I thought that was the end of it. My lights were safe, Karen was no longer in power, and life could return to normal. I should have known better. 3 weeks later, I was out running errands on a Saturday morning when I got a frantic call from Susan Park. "Lucas, you need to get home right now," she said, her voice shaking. "Karen is at the community gazebo with a ladder and tools. I think she's taking down the lights." My blood ran cold. The lights I'd installed on the community gazebo, completely at my own expense as a donation to the neighborhood. I'd spent over $2,000 on materials and labor to light that gazebo, making it a beautiful focal point for the small park. "Call the police," I said, already turning my car around. "She's destroying my property." "Are you sure? I mean, it's on community property." I donated those lights, but the donation was never formally accepted by the HOA. They're still legally my property. Call the police and tell them someone is vandalizing private property. I drove home faster than I should have, my mind racing. I'd been so focused on defending my house lights that I hadn't even thought about the gazebo. Those lights had been up since November, and everyone loved them. The gazebo had become a popular spot for evening walks and small gatherings, specifically because the lighting made it so inviting. I pulled into my driveway and literally ran the 2 blocks to the park. Sure enough, Karen was on a ladder, yanking down the string lights I'd carefully installed around the gazebo's roof. She'd already removed about half of them, and they lay in a tangled heap on the ground. Some of the bulbs were clearly broken. "Karen, stop," I shouted as I approached. "Those are my property," she glared down at me from the ladder. "These lights were installed on community property without board approval. I'm removing them." "You're destroying my property," I said, pulling out my phone to take photos and video. "And you're no longer the board president. You have no authority to do this. The gazebo is HOA property, which means these lights became HOA property when you installed them," she said, continuing to pull them down. "That's not how donations work. I never signed a donation agreement. I never transferred ownership. Those lights are mine, and you're vandalizing them." A police cruiser pulled up to the curb and Officer Martinez stepped out. I'd gone to high school with his younger brother, and I'd seen him around the neighborhood before. "What's going on here?" he asked, assessing the situation. "Officer, I'm so glad you're here," Karen said, climbing down from the ladder. "This man installed lights on community property without permission, and I'm removing them on behalf of the HOA. "That's not accurate," I said quickly. "I installed those lights at my own expense as a donation." "The donation was never formally accepted, so they're still my property. She's destroying them without permission." Officer Martinez looked between us. "Do you have documentation of ownership?" I pulled up my phone and showed him the receipts I'd saved digitally. I purchased all the materials and paid for the installation, over $2,000 total. I intended to donate them, but there was never a formal acceptance process or transfer of ownership. Karen crossed her arms. "He put them on HOA property." "Madam, that doesn't automatically transfer ownership," Officer Martinez said. "If he purchased and installed them, and there's no documentation showing he gave them to the HOA, they're still his property. You can't remove or destroy them without his permission." "This is ridiculous," Karen sputtered. "I'm a member of the HOA board." "Actually, you're not anymore," I said. "You were removed from your position as president 3 weeks ago. You're just a regular homeowner now." Officer Martinez pulled out his notepad. "Madam, I'm going to need to see some identification. And sir, do you want to press charges for vandalism?" I looked at the broken lights on the ground, then at Karen's furious face. Part of me wanted to press charges to make her face consequences for her actions. But another part of me just wanted this to be over. "I want her to stop destroying my property," I said. "And I want the HOA to either formally accept the lights as a donation and leave them up, or I'll remove them myself." "You'll remove them?" Karen asked, surprise clear in her voice. "If the HOA doesn't want them, I'll take them down," I said. "But I'll do it properly, and I'll decide what happens to them. Not you." Officer Martinez looked relieved that I wasn't pushing for charges. "Madam, you need to step away from the gazebo and leave the lights alone. If the HOA has issues with them, you need to go through proper channels." Karen looked like she wanted to argue, but the presence of a police officer clearly gave her pause. "Fine, but those lights are coming down one way or another." She stormed off toward her car, leaving the ladder and tools behind. Officer Martinez took my statement and photographed the damage, creating an official report just in case. Susan Park and a few other neighbors had gathered during the confrontation, and they assured Officer Martinez that they'd witnessed Karen damaging the lights. After Officer Martinez left, I examined the damage more carefully. About half the string lights were down, and maybe 20% of those were broken. The rest could potentially be salvaged and reinstalled, but the professional installation was ruined. It would take hours of work to fix. Marcus jogged up, having seen the police car. What happened? I filled him in, my anger returning as I recounted the story. She couldn't control my house lights, so she went after the ones I donated. That's insane, Marcus said. Everyone loves these lights. Susan spoke up. We should have a neighborhood meeting, not an HOA meeting, just neighbors. We need to talk about what's been happening. That meeting happened organically, right there in the park. People who'd come to see what the police were doing stayed to talk. Others walking by stopped when they saw the group. Within 30 minutes, there were about 20 neighbors gathered, and the consensus was clear. They wanted the gazebo lights to stay, and they were tired of Karen's behavior. Someone needs to formally accept the donation, Susan said. If the board won't do it, maybe we can petition them. Frank is reasonable, someone else added. He'd probably approve it if we asked. I held up my hands. I appreciate the support, but at this point, I'm not sure I want to leave the lights here. If Karen is going to vandalize them every time she has a bad day, it's not worth it. That caused an uproar. Multiple people spoke at once, saying they'd watch the gazebo, they'd report any vandalism, they'd support me however they could. It was touching, but I was also exhausted from months of fighting. Let me think about it, I said finally. I need to talk to Frank and the board anyway about what happened today. I called Frank that evening and explained the situation. He was appalled. She did what? He exclaimed. Lucas, I'm so sorry, this is completely unacceptable. I just want to know if the HOA wants the lights or not, I said. If you do, I'll repair them and reinstall them, and we'll formalize it with a proper donation agreement. If you don't, I'll remove them and donate them somewhere else. Of course we want them, Frank said immediately. They're beautiful and everyone loves them. I'll call an emergency board meeting for tomorrow. We'll get this sorted out. The next evening, I met with Frank, Patricia, and Dennis at Frank's house. Karen had not been invited, obviously. They'd prepared a simple donation acceptance agreement, and they couldn't apologize enough for what had happened. We're considering legal action against Karen, Dennis said. Her behavior has created liability for the HOA. If you'd pressed charges yesterday, we could have been sued. I don't want to escalate things, I said. I just want to move forward. We understand, Patricia said. But Lucas, you need to know that several other homeowners are documenting issues with Karen too. She's been harassing people even after being removed from the board. There might be a restraining order in the works. That was news to me. She's harassing other people. At least 4 households that we know of, Frank confirmed. She's obsessed with control, and she can't handle that she doesn't have it anymore. I signed the donation agreement, and the board signed as well. The gazebo lights were now officially property of the HOA, with the stipulation that I'd repair the damaged sections at no cost. In return, the HOA agreed to maintain them going forward and to install security cameras in the park to prevent future vandalism. Over the next week, I worked on repairing the gazebo lights. It was frustrating work, replacing broken bulbs and rewiring sections that Karen had damaged. Marcus helped, and so did a few other neighbors. It became a community project, with people bringing coffee and snacks, and kids playing in the park while we worked. The security cameras went up the same week, professional installations paid for by the HOA. Frank made sure everyone knew they were there, sending out a newsletter that included photos of the cameras and a notice that the park was now under video surveillance. The harassment stopped after that. I didn't know if it was the cameras, the threat of legal action, or if Karen had finally accepted defeat, but life returned to normal. My house lights stayed up, the gazebo lights were restored and looked better than ever, and the HOA functioned smoothly under Frank's leadership. I saw Karen occasionally around the neighborhood. She'd glare at me from her car or turn abruptly and walk the other way if we were on the same sidewalk. It was childish but harmless, and I had no interest in engaging with her. Then, in early March, everything came to a head in a way I never expected. I got a call from Officer Martinez asking if I could come down to the police station. He wouldn't say why over the phone, just that it was important and related to the incident at the gazebo. Confused and a little worried, I drove to the Riverside Police Department. Officer Martinez met me in the lobby and led me to a small conference room where a detective was waiting. "Mr. Thompson, I'm Detective Sarah Chen," she said, shaking my hand. "No relation to your attorney. I want to ask you some questions about Karen Grayson." My stomach dropped. "What about her? We've received multiple reports of harassment, vandalism, and potentially more serious crimes connected to Miss Grayson. Your name came up in several reports. Can you walk me through your interactions with her?" I spent the next hour recounting everything. The initial confrontation about my lights, the HOA meeting, the false violation notices, the gazebo incident, all of it. Detective Chen took detailed notes and asked for copies of my documentation. "What's this about?" I asked when we were done. "What did she do?" Detective Chen glanced at Officer Martinez, who nodded slightly. "We're investigating multiple incidents of vandalism, harassment, and trespassing. Miss Grayson was caught on security camera damaging property at 3 different homes in your neighborhood. She also allegedly entered someone's backyard without permission to document supposed violations." "That's crazy," I said, though part of me wasn't surprised. Karen had been escalating for months. "The homeowner whose property she entered wants to press charges for trespassing. 2 others want to press charges for vandalism. And we have your documented case from the gazebo. That's multiple criminal counts." I sat back in my chair, processing this information. "She's going to be arrested?" "Likely, yes. We're building a comprehensive case. I wanted to ask if you'd be willing to testify if this goes to trial and whether you want to press charges for the gazebo incident." I thought about it. Part of me felt sorry for Karen, despite everything she'd put me through. She'd let her need for control consume her to the point of criminal behavior. But another part of me knew that she needed to face consequences, or she'd keep harassing people. "Yes," I said finally. "I'll testify and I want to press charges. She caused over $500 in damages to my property." "Thank you," Detective Chen said. "We'll be in touch as the case progresses." Karen was arrested 2 days later. The story spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Apparently, she'd been caught on camera spray painting obscenities on the car of a neighbor who testified against her at a board meeting. That, combined with the evidence from the gazebo incident and 2 cases of garden vandalism, was enough for the district attorney to file multiple charges. The whole neighborhood was in shock. Yes, Karen had been difficult and controlling, but none of us had realized how far gone she really was. According to the police reports that eventually became public, she'd been engaging in a months-long campaign of harassment and vandalism against anyone she perceived as having wronged her. The trial happened in late May. I was called to testify about the gazebo incident. It was strange seeing Karen in a courtroom, looking small and defeated in a way I'd never seen before. She'd always been so aggressive, so confident in her rightness. Now she just looked tired and sad. My testimony was straightforward. I explained about the lights, the donation, and the destruction. I provided receipts and photos. The defense attorney tried to argue that I'd abandoned the lights by installing them on community property, but the prosecution countered with the donation agreement timeline and California property law. The jury looked skeptical of the defense's arguments. Other homeowners testified too. The man whose car she'd vandalized, the woman whose garden she'd destroyed, pulling up over $100 worth of plants because they were supposedly the wrong species. The couple whose backyard she'd entered without permission, trying to photograph their patio furniture to prove it violated some imaginary covenant about outdoor storage. The pattern was clear. Karen couldn't handle not being in control, and she'd lashed out at anyone who challenged her authority. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. They found Karen guilty on multiple counts of vandalism, 1 count of trespassing, and multiple counts of criminal harassment. The judge, clearly tired of this case, sentenced her to 6 months in county jail, 3 years probation, mandatory anger management and psychological counseling, and restitution to all the victims. I received a check for $567, covering the damage to my lights plus court fees. It felt hollow somehow, receiving money for what had become such a massive neighborhood drama. After the trial, Frank called a neighborhood meeting, a real one this time with good news to share. The board had used the insurance settlement from Karen's actions to fund several neighborhood improvements, new playground equipment, additional security cameras, and improvements to the community center. We also voted to establish a clearer process for donations, Frank announced, so that if anyone wants to contribute improvements in the future, like Lucas did with the gazebo lights, there's a formal procedure that protects both the donor and the HOA. There was applause at that. I stood up and waved awkwardly, still not entirely comfortable being the center of attention for all this. Life slowly returned to normal over the following months. Karen served her jail time and moved out of the neighborhood shortly after her release. I heard through the grapevine that she'd relocated to Nevada to live with family, and I hoped she was getting the help she needed. The gazebo lights became a neighborhood fixture. People took evening walks just to enjoy them. Several families held birthday parties and small gatherings at the gazebo specifically because the lighting made it such a pleasant space. Other homeowners started installing similar lighting on their own homes, hiring the same electrician I'd used and following the same process I'd documented. Frank served out his term as HOA president and was then elected properly by a large margin. Patricia and Dennis remained on the board, and they brought in 2 new members who actually wanted to serve the community rather than control it. HOA meetings became shorter, less contentious, and focused on actual community improvements rather than petty enforcement actions. My lights stayed up, of course. They became something I was known for in the neighborhood. "Oh, you're looking for Lucas Thompson. He's the guy with the beautiful lighting." It was a nice reputation to have, much better than being known as the guy who fought with the HOA. I ran into Susan Park at the grocery store about a year after everything had settled down. We'd become friends throughout the ordeal, bonding over shared frustration with Karen's behavior. "You know, I was thinking about everything that happened," she said as we stood in the produce section. "It's kind of amazing how it all worked out. Your lights stayed up, the community came together, and we got rid of a toxic board president. And I learned a lot about HOA law," I added with a laugh. "That too. But seriously, you could have just taken the lights down when Karen first complained. It would have been easier." I'd thought about that many times over the past year. Would it have been easier to just comply to avoid the conflict? Probably. But it also would have set a precedent that the HOA could make arbitrary demands without basis in the actual rules. It wasn't really about the lights, I said, finally putting words to what I'd been feeling. It was about whether the HOA serves the community or controls it. If I'd backed down, Karen would have just found something else to target in my yard or someone else's. Someone had to stand up and say that the rules matter and they have to be applied fairly. Susan nodded thoughtfully. Well, I'm glad you did. And I'm glad you donated those gazebo lights, even though it turned into such a mess. Me too, I said, and I meant it. The gazebo lights were still burning every evening, a small but meaningful contribution to the neighborhood. My house lights continued to welcome me home each night, a reminder that sometimes standing your ground is worth the fight. And the HOA, under Frank's steady leadership, had transformed from a source of anxiety into what it was supposed to be all along. A functional organization that maintained common areas and enforced reasonable rules fairly. On warm evenings, I'd sometimes walk down to the park and sit at the gazebo, watching neighbors stroll by and kids play on the improved playground equipment. The lights I'd installed created a warm, inviting space that brought people together. That had been my goal from the beginning, before Karen's complaints turned it into a battle. David Chen, my attorney, sent me a final invoice with a note. Glad we could resolve this without full litigation. Try to stay out of trouble with your HOA. I replied with a laughing emoji and a promise to keep him updated if I decided to install any more lights. Though honestly, after everything that had happened, I was content with what I had. My house looked beautiful, the community space was improved, and I'd learned valuable lessons about standing up for what's right even when it's difficult. The whole experience had taught me something important about community living. HOAs exist to maintain property values and community standards, but they're run by volunteers who are just regular people with their own biases and issues. When those volunteers overstep their authority, homeowners have both the right and the responsibility to push back, using the very rules the HOA is supposed to enforce. Marcus hosted a barbecue that summer, and half the neighborhood showed up. We ate burgers and drank beer, and someone made a joke about HOA compliance and whether Marcus had filed the proper paperwork for outdoor cooking. Everyone laughed, including Frank, who was there with his wife. You know, Frank said to me later that evening, I was talking to some people from other HOAs around Riverside. Your story has gotten around. You're famous in local HOA circles as the guy who stood up to an overreaching board president. I don't know if that's a good thing or not, I said. It's definitely a good thing. A lot of HOA boards have gotten the message that homeowners are paying attention and won't tolerate arbitrary enforcement. You might have improved HOA governance throughout the city. I doubted my impact was quite that significant, but it was nice to think that the ordeal had some positive effect beyond just my own neighborhood. As the sun set that evening, my house lights automatically turned on, their warm glow visible from Marcus's backyard 3 streets away. Several people commented on how nice they looked. No one suggested they were too bright, too commercial, or violated any covenants. They were just lights, doing what lights are supposed to do, illuminating the darkness and making the world a little more welcoming. Karen's reign as HOA president had lasted only 6 months, but her impact had been significant. Not in the way she'd intended, though. Instead of creating a more controlled, uniform neighborhood according to her vision, she'd catalyzed a movement toward fair enforcement, community involvement, and resistance to arbitrary authority. The homeowners of Riverside Estates were now more engaged, more informed about their rights, and more willing to question decisions that didn't make sense. The covenant amendment Karen had wanted to push through, the one that would have banned decorative exterior lighting, never happened. In fact, the board went the other direction, clarifying several covenant provisions to be more permissive and less open to subjective interpretation. They wanted to avoid future conflicts like mine, and the best way to do that was to write clear, objective standards that couldn't be twisted to suit personal preferences. I kept every piece of documentation from the entire ordeal: the violation notices, my response letters, the hearing transcripts, the police reports, the court documents. I stored them in a folder on my computer and in a physical filing cabinet, just in case. David Chen had told me to keep everything for at least 7 years, the statute of limitations for most civil claims in California. But honestly, I didn't think I'd ever need them again. The neighborhood had learned its lesson about the dangers of unchecked HOA authority, and the new board was committed to fair, transparent governance. We had regular meetings, clear communication through email newsletters and a community website, and an open-door policy for homeowner concerns. One unexpected positive outcome was that I got hired for several design jobs from neighbors who'd been impressed with my lighting installation. Word of mouth spread that I was an architect with an eye for detail, and suddenly I had clients throughout Riverside. The Karen situation, as miserable as it had been while happening, had actually boosted my business. 2 years after the initial confrontation, I was sitting on my front porch again, drinking morning coffee and enjoying the early light. My neighbor from across the street, a new resident who'd moved in after Karen left, walked over to introduce himself. "Hey, I'm Robert. Just wanted to say your lights are incredible. Who did the installation?" I gave him the electrician's contact information and explained the whole process, how I'd researched the covenants, obtained permits, and ensured everything was compliant before installation. "That seems like a lot of work just for lights," Robert said. "It was," I agreed. "But it was worth it to do it right and avoid problems later." I didn't tell him about Karen, about the meetings and the hearings and the trial. That was all in the past, and he didn't need to hear the drama. He'd form his own relationship with the HOA based on his own experiences, hopefully all positive under Frank's continued leadership. As Robert walked back to his house, I reflected on how much had changed in 2 years. The neighborhood felt more cohesive now, more like an actual community rather than just a collection of houses governed by arbitrary rules. People knew each other, looked out for each other, and took pride in the shared spaces. And every evening as the sun set over Riverside, California, lights clicked on throughout the neighborhood. Security lights, landscape lights, architectural lights like mine. Each installation had been done properly, with permits and covenant compliance, because I'd proven that it was possible to enhance your property while still following the rules. The gazebo lights remained the crown jewel of the neighborhood, though. On summer evenings, teenagers gathered there after dark, their laughter echoing through the park. Young couples took engagement photos under the lit structure. Parents brought their kids to play in the illuminated space after dinner. That community feature, nearly destroyed by one person's need for control, had become the heart of Riverside Estates. I never regretted fighting for those lights, either set. The thousands of dollars spent, the stress of the conflict, the time invested in documentation and hearings and testimony, all of it was worth it. Because in the end, it wasn't about lights at all. It was about the principle that homeowners have rights, that rules should be applied fairly, and that communities thrive when people stand up for what's right, rather than accepting what's convenient. Karen Grayson had tried to exert control over something that wasn't hers to control, and she'd paid a steep price for it. Her position, her reputation, her freedom for 6 months, and ultimately her home in the neighborhood. I hoped she'd found peace wherever she'd ended up, and that she'd learned something from the experience. As for me, I'd learned plenty too. I'd learned about HOA law and property rights, about community organizing and standing firm in the face of opposition. I'd learned that sometimes the right thing to do is also the hard thing to do, and that's okay. I'd learned that most people are reasonable if you give them the facts and treat them with respect. And I'd learned that a good set of lights, properly installed and legally compliant, can illuminate more than just a house or a gazebo. They can illuminate the path forward for an entire community. The sun fully emerged over the horizon, and I finished my coffee. Another day in Riverside Estates, peaceful and drama-free. My lights would click on again tonight, as they did every night, a constant in a world that had been anything but constant during those turbulent months with Karen. But that was behind us now. The neighborhood had healed, moved forward, and grown stronger. And my lights kept shining, exactly as they were meant to do, exactly as the covenants allowed them to do, exactly as they would continue to do for years to come.